This happened to my dad back in the 60s when he was a kid. He grew up with a brother and his parents in the rural part of Michigan. I had asked him once or twice about his younger brother when I discovered he'd had one. This is the story he told me of why he was missing from our lives. This is in his words, more or less. We were the example of hicks when I was growing up. My great-grandparents had come over from Sweden back in the 1800s, and nobody had left the farm since then except a fight in Europe. Our lives depended on the weather and what the land could provide for us. We didn't even get electricity until I was 8 years old. We did have automobiles, but they were usually old and worn out by the time they got to us, put together with baling wire and stuff like that. Well, my little brother Bill and I went out one morning, I think it was early February, to go hunt some rabbits for the pot. That should give you an idea of how we were back then. But Bill and I, we didn't know any better. We never had to be asked twice to go hunting. That morning was incredibly cold and there was snow 2 or 3 inches overnight. I had on almost every bit of clothing I owned, and so did Bill. It was about 9 before we left the house. We were headed to the woods that sat across the lake. The woods took up about 30 acres of our 50, and it was chock full of game, big and small. I was carrying the .410, and Bill had the .22. Both of us had our pockets overfull with extra ammo. Ammo is one of those things even folks had a lot of back then. We were kind of in a hurry because we got started later than normal, and I wasn't paying as close attention as I should have been. Between sunup and when we left, it had probably warmed up about at least 20 degrees. We hadn't made it 100 yards before we turned back to shed some layers. Mama yelled at us to stop around and get to hunting. So my mind was on getting to the woods as fast as possible. It took us about 10 minutes to reach the lake. The layer of snow on the top of the ice had already melted, leaving the ice slicker than normal. Under normal circumstances, we would have stepped lightly as we crossed so as not to end up on our butts. But this morning, we were running late. I slipped a couple of times, and Bill, who was behind me a few steps, had to hold onto my coat to stay upright on a few occasions. I could see tracks leading into the trees as we got close, and my pace began to pick up. It was about 20 yards from the end of the ice when I heard a loud bang, quickly followed by a splash. I looked back to check on Bill, only to see that he disappeared. I saw that a hole had broken through the ice, roughly 2 feet across. It was clear what had happened. So, I did something that probably wasn't very wise and threw myself under the ice. I jammed my arms into the hole, reaching all around it, feeling for one of Bill's hands or arms. It didn't take but less than a minute for my arms to start screaming in pain from the cold water, and I began panicking because I knew every second he was in that ice-cold water, he was less likely to come out. I didn't want to take my arm out of the water, but I knew I couldn't stand the pain one moment more. I stared at the hole, hoping to see Bill pop out of it while I rubbed the feeling back into my arms. I was just about to give up when I got the idea to break off a long tree limb and stick it down in the hole. I found one. Then it took me a few seconds to break it. But once I had, I ran back to the hole and stuck it into the water. I'd switch sides of the hole every few seconds, hoping I'd feel him grab onto the stick. I carried on with this for a couple of minutes until I realized it was pointless. There was nothing else I could do but run home and ask my papa for help. I still had that last shred of hope that he would find a way to save him. But when I ran into the house and told him what happened, his face said it all. Seeing that expression on his face stripped me of that last shred, and I collapsed on the floor and bawled like I never had before. It only got when Mama came into the room and Papa gave her the news. Her wailing only made my sadness and guilt, yes, guilt, that much. At some point that day, I began to get an idea in my head that my folks may blame me for Bill's death. They had both told me more than once that my job was to protect my little brother, and I had it up. After crying myself to sleep that night, the next morning, I was terrified to leave my room. I wasn't sure what was going to happen to me. All kinds of ideas were swirling around in my head. At one point, I had even convinced myself that they'd give me away to an orphanage for being such an awful son. It took my folks a few hours to convince me to come out, and I only did when they promised that they weren't at me. That didn't stop me from apologizing when I saw them. They said it was just a terrible accident and nobody was to blame. We all broke down after that and held each other and cried for a long time. That scene would be played out a bunch of times over the next few weeks. The thing that made things more painful, perhaps, was the wait for the lake to thaw before we could find Bill's body and bury it. Finally, around the last week of April, it had warmed up enough to retrieve his body from the lake and have the funeral. Mama and I cried most that day. It wasn't until around the time you were born that the two of us were talking and thinking back to those days that Mama admitted to me that she felt guilty too, since she'd sent us out that morning and told us to hurry. We both came to the conclusion that neither of us was truly at fault. It was nothing more than an accident we were helpless to prevent. To tell the truth, on any other February day, that lake would have been frozen 3 feet down and hard as a rock. It just happened. It was one of those once-in-a-lifetime days. It wasn't, I can't speak for Mama, but that day was when I was finally able to let go of all my guilt once and for all. Well, Junior, that's most of it that I can remember. File that away in your mind somewhere safe, because I ain't telling her ever again. Those were the words that he told me, and I was at a loss for words. I never in my life heard my dad be so open about his life and upbringing. I knew he'd been pretty, but that was it. In the silence, he drifted off somewhere into his past, now unaware of my presence. Dredging up all of that grief had turned his eyes red and filled them with tears. I decided I'd slip quietly out of the room to leave him alone with his memories. My dad and I had our share of clashes and have often gone long periods not speaking to one another, but after hearing that story, I was able to see him in a bit of a more positive light. I realize now even someone as hard as a rock like him can hurt deep down. I realized he's as human as the rest of us. Winter is long and cold up here, but fun nonetheless. As a child, I would stay outside all day playing in the snow. Then, I'd have to soak my hands in warm water for 10 minutes just to get the feeling back in them. Stupid or not, those were the best times of my life. However, the winter I was in 5th grade, something would be set in motion in my town. School would just let out for Christmas break when the first body was found. His name was Mike Keller, and he was a 2nd grader from Mount Vernon. The reports in the news said that he had been beaten severely, but he also had multiple stab wounds that were determined to be the cause of death. I can't say that they caused an uproar, that would come later, but it certainly got folks' attention. It didn't put a dent in my thick head. If my mom mentioned it to me, I don't recall it. My usual life continued unabated. Day after day, I would spend my time playing in the snow, only taking breaks to eat and play Minecraft. Things didn't really ramp up until another kid was found. This one turned out to be from my neck of the woods. The police reports echoed that of the previous, although the stab wounds were far more numerous than on the body of Keller. Now is when the parents countywide started taking the threat more seriously. I'm sure every kid got the same speech I did, warning of the dangers of talking to people you didn't know. When everyone would discover the truth behind, it would be much more than they expected. If any kid paid attention to the parents' warnings, I wasn't one of them. My mom's words went in one ear and out the other. Since the snow had long melted after Christmas Day, I had plans to meet up with friends at our hand-built forts in the woods. But when I got there, the only people around were 2 kids I didn't know very well. One was a 7th grader, and the other was a year behind me. He went to the same school as I did, and the rumor was that he had been held back twice. From the looks of him, the rumors were true. Despite only being slightly taller than me, he was already showing signs of a mustache. When it comes to the older kids, I didn't know much about him, other than they had a reputation for being mean. The younger kids, so the second I saw him, I got very nervous. The two of them, whose names I'm not going to mention here for the reason you will soon see, were acting like they were my best friends, despite never talking to me before. When the older boy asked me if my friends were on the way, I foolishly told the truth. If they weren't already at the fort, they probably wouldn't be coming. This must have been the answer they were hoping for, because as soon as I said it, they began their attack. The older boy sucker punched me to the ground. I came very close to passing out. Now I know if I had, I would have been number 3 on their hit list. But somehow, I stayed awake. I used a nearby tree to get to my feet just in time to see the younger kid pull a folding knife from his pocket. The older kid was swinging the wooden bat around. When they saw me stand up, the older boy ran up to me and swung for my head. I ducked, but he was close enough to a lock of hair out when the bat hit the tree above me. I figured the kid with a knife was coming after me next, so I booked it. My legs were still a little rubbery, but I knew if I stopped, I was dead. The older kid was right on my heels, and my lungs were burning terribly. However, I was fortunate to live on the edge of the woods and made it inside my house before they caught up with me. I ran into my mom, and I breathlessly tried to explain what had just happened. She understood enough to be upset and yelled for my dad to call the police. My mom quickly explained the situation to him, and he relayed it to the dispatcher. The police came quick, and I told them what had happened and who did it. They had no problem finding the boys. They must have known it was over for them, and they both went home and waited. The brutality of the was taken into consideration, and it was decided to keep them in custody until their trials. Naturally, the DA wanted to try them but they were just a bit too young. Since each boy was blaming the other, despite both being responsible, they were tried separately. Neither showed any remorse, and as a result, they were given life for each and 15 to 25 for the attempt on my life. Had this happened just a few years earlier, they both would have been likely given life without parole for each charge. The recent legislation states that an offender cannot be given such a sentence if they committed their crime as a youthful offender. Ultimately, the legislation mattered not. Both boys were transferred to the system at 21, and because of crimes they committed inside, they probably won't ever get out. And that's the way that I like it. It was glaringly obvious to everyone around at that time that they weren't right in the head. It's just terrible that 2 young boys and almost me had to lose their lives before something was done about it. I had taken my yearly journey to the woods to hunt since I was 14. Last year started just as every other one before had, but it would end much earlier and in a very different way than usual. Despite the weather being too warm for hunting, I was out at dawn on opening day like always. As the season drags on, the deer get more skittish, so starting as early as you can increase your chances. On the land I've been hunting on for the past 7 years, I had a small handful of preferred spots, and this is where I was heading. The spot was a tree stand sitting roughly 30 feet high in an old oak that looked out across one of 3 feed plots. I had good luck there more than once and hoped to have it again. The drive out to the stand took about 15 minutes from my cabin, so I left an hour before dawn. I wanted to be on the stand just as the first bit of light broke. As usual, I parked my 4-wheeler about 50 yards away and walked the rest of the way in. I'm not sure if it makes any real difference, but not making a bunch of noise right next to where I'd be hunting seems like a wise idea, so it's a practice I try to remember to do each time I hunt. Although I've been up over an hour and had a couple of cups of coffee, I was probably a little groggy. I've never been a morning type of guy, and once I retired, I've gotten up when I woke up, no certain time. So, I slung my rifle onto my back and began to climb. About 3 steps from the top with the seat in sight, one of my feet slipped from the ladder and I fell about 25 feet onto my back. Somehow, my rifle ended up next to me rather than under. There was no pain at first, so I figured I'd just get up and dust myself off. However, I discovered very quickly that at least one, if not both legs, were broken. As I sat up to examine my legs, pain began shooting through my back and body. It appeared then that, in addition to broken legs, I had a major back injury. My usual high pain tolerance was letting me down, and the adrenaline was beginning to wear off. I knew in a matter of minutes I was going to be screaming in pain. I began feeling for my phone and soon found it in my chest pocket. Luckily, I didn't land on my chest right. Being out in the middle of nowhere didn't necessarily mean there wouldn't be any cell service. And in my neck of the woods, cell towers are more common in trees. I dialed 911 and waited, but the call dropped. The pain was making me very nauseous, and I was having a hard time concentrating. It took me a moment to realize I was going to need to move if I had a chance of getting help. I couldn't think of any other ways, so I gritted my teeth and rolled over onto my stomach. The pain very nearly caused me to pass out, but the star soon passed, and I began pulling myself forward with my arms. I made it around 15 yards before I was forced to take a break. Once I had pulled myself together, I tried to call 911 again, but it was a no-go. I looked around and noticed I was still under the trees, but there was a clearing not far away. I gritted my teeth again and hauled myself toward it. I had to take a couple of breaks, but eventually I was in the open. I crossed my fingers and pressed send. The wait was agonizing, but it finally began ringing, and I was connected to a dispatcher. The pain made the wait for help to arrive seem even longer, but because of my location and clear directions, they made it to me within 30 minutes. As I laid there, I watched the sunrise, thinking how beautiful a scene it was to see. I only wished it was under better circumstances. By the time I was released from the hospital a few days later, I would have 2 broken legs and a broken back, which really was cruciate vertebrae. The legs would just have to heal with time, but with my back, I've had to have a couple of those vertebrae fused. The surgery was done just a few months before this year's hunting season started, and you can be sure I was there, waiting for the sun to rise on the first morning. One thing has changed, however. For the time being, I'll be hunting from a blind on the ground. There's no way I'm gonna go another year with an empty freezer.